In this video, we will learn how to configure the start node of endpoint services. Endpoint services will most probably the most frequently used services when you are building your backend applications, and they are basically RESTful API endpoints, and whenever they are called, the associated endpoint service is executed. So it's quite important to understand what type of input parameters that you can use and how you can configure those input parameters for endpoint services. In short, there are lots of or different kinds of parameters that you can pass through the endpoint services, through the start node of the endpoint services. Obviously, the first parameter that you can pass is the IDs. Whatever ID numbers, unique identifiers, object identifiers that you put on the endpoint path definition, you can pass those parameters, their values to your start node. The second type of parameter that you can pass is the query string parameters. These are basically the parameters that are appended to the end of the URL of the endpoint, and you can also pass these parameters. The next one is the headers. In the request headers, the RESTful API request headers, you can also pass additional parameters. The next one is the app parameters. These are Altogic specific internal parameters that you can use throughout your application. You can think of the app parameters of environment variables, where you can specify the standard or default values for some key parameters, like the API key values or some values that you are using your expressions or validation rules. The next parameter, which Altogic automatically creates and injects to your start node, is the client information, which basically consists of the IP of the calling party and also the type of the device. If the caller's device type can be item like the laptop or desktop or mobile device. Next, the session. If the endpoint requires a session token, then also the let's say the decrypted session object is also injected into the start node. Next two parameters are related to the file uploads. If you're uploading files in your endpoint service, then files and list of file objects are also injected as input parameters to your start node. The final two parameters are the DB transactions. If you are running multiple database operations in your service, then you might consider using transactions to ensure integrity of the data in your database. So you can create multiple DB transactions and use them in your database nodes. In that case, the DB transactions are also injected as input to the start node. And finally, the request body. If your endpoint is a post request or a put request, most probably you will be sending some parameters or objects or list of objects in the body of your request, and those parameters are sent as body parameters as input to your start node. So as you can see, and there are lots of input parameters that you can pass to the start node. So we will go over each of them one by one and see what that means in Altogic and how you configure each of them. To test how input parameters are configured and how they are passed to the start node, we will be creating a dummy endpoint service. So let's first create the dummy endpoint. Call it, let's say, dummy endpoint. And assuming that this will be a post request, okay, then let's put it, let's say, dummy for the moment. And the routed service will be like dummy service. Let's get to the details of the dummy service. What we will be doing is, it will be a very simple service. Whatever request is coming as input to the start node, we will return it as a response. That's it. That's what we will be doing. Let's deploy this service endpoint to an environment. Let's create an environment. Let's call it development. And let's deploy our snapshot to this environment. So the deployment is completed, and we can go to our test panel to test it. Click on the test button, and we've got this dummy endpoint service here. It doesn't require any kind of parameters right now. Okay, what we need to do is we need to create an API key for this to work. Just quickly create an API key and set it as a default API key. That's it. Let's run it. Okay, so we run it and we only get the client part of the request. This is the value, the IP address and the device type that is injected to our start node. So basically this client part, by default, it's always injected to the endpoint start node. The next thing we can test is how the ID parameters are passed and how we can see those parameters, right? So we go back to our service, actually to endpoint, click on the dummy endpoint. Let's change this one here, okay? Let's assume that we will be sending like a user ID, and for the users, for the specific users, we will be getting books, and among those books we will be getting maybe like a specific book, right? So we would like to get details about the specific book of a user. But we define these IDs, okay? How we can test this one? So if I go back to here, okay, if I clear the cache for this one, our endpoint is updated, okay? So I need to pass some parameters here. The IDs are 24 character long alphanumeric strings, text values in Altogic, and they've got a specific format, so you cannot use something random, okay? So they should obey a specific standard. For example, these are some ID numbers. For testing purposes, I will copy some of these values here, okay? Another one is this one, okay? Let's see how the input parameters, the request object structure of the start node looks like. Okay, so as usual, we got the client, but on top of that one, we also get a new parameter, IDs, and under IDs, you got user ID and book ID. These are the values of those user ID and book ID. So, okay, we also covered the ID. Let's configure about some query string parameters and header parameters. How do I do this? I mean, for configuring the query parameters and header parameters, you need to go to the service definition, and you need to click on the start node and add query string parameters and header parameters. Let's add some query string parameters. Let's give it a name like param1. This will be a text parameter. Another one is param2. This will be, let's say, an integer parameter. For the headers, let's say the powered by, the name of the parameter header will be powered by, it will be a text. And let's see how we will be passing these values. Let's go back to the test panel. Okay, then when I click on the params part, I see that there are two parameters. The first one will be text value, let's say value of param1, and the second parameter needs to be an integer. Let's put here 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I go to the headers, then I need to provide another parameter like Altogic. Okay, if I run this thing, okay, I've got another thing, right? Right now, besides IDs, client, I've got two additional parameters that I can pass to our start node. The first one is the headers, powered by, the value of that one is Altogic, and the query parameters, param1 and param2, the value of param1 and 1, 2, 3, 4. So we also covered the query parameters and headers parameters. The next one is the application parameters. Okay, how can I configure application parameters? To configure the application parameters, I need to go to the settings, application settings, and click on the parameters tab. And from the parameters tab, I can configure these application specific parameters or environment variables. Let's say in our services, we will be using, let's say, SendGrid service, and SendGrid requires an API key. Let's assume that we will be putting the parameter of the API key here. This will be a text value, and the API key value will be something, I don't know, some random stuff. Okay, let's put that one here. Okay, let's run our endpoint service again. Okay, this time another value, another parameter is injected to the start node. This time SendGrid API key is also injected as a parameter, as an input parameter to our start node. Okay, we also covered the app parameters. So IDs, query, headers, app parameters, client, we covered all of those things. Let's cover body and the DB transactions. They are much more easier to cover. So let's assume that in our dummy service, in the start node configuration, we will be sending some body data, right? So the request body, assuming that we will be sending some book information for some reason, okay? I don't know, whatever the reason. So if I go back to here And if I go back to the body definition right now, I need to refresh this thing. Okay. So the title of the book will be book title. Author will be XYZ, whatever. Total pages is 235, 34. Language will be English. So I need to put the parameters again in here. The parameter 1 will be value of parameter 1. Parameter 2 will be 1, 2, 3, 4. Body, I already defined the body. The header will be Altogic. Okay, so let's run this stuff. Okay, so okay, I need to also pass this stuff here because I cleared the cache for the tests. So I need to pass these values also. Okay, so what I get in here now, IDs, headers, query, and also the body. So in the body of the request, I get this use a book object, right? The input book object that I pass as input to my start node. So far we covered the body also. Let's cover the DB transactions. How we configure the DB transaction. Again, on our start node, we go down, and if you will be using any database transactions, if you will be executing multiple database operations, it might be a good idea to use a transaction in order to ensure data integrity. So we can create database transactions like a transaction 1, maybe another transaction 2. Okay, let's go back to the test panel and run our service again. Okay, this time we again get the transaction information, transaction 1 and transaction 2. These are transaction objects, and we only get the ID information for the transactions. That's it. What else we have? We also covered the transactions body. The final ones will be the files and file list. Okay, how we will be passing the file information. So we also need to go back to our service, and we need to specify some file uploads. But this one is disabled. Why it is disabled? Because in order to upload files while also sending some parameters in the body of the request, it should be multi-part request. So we will be adding a request by saying that, hey, user object will be provided as user. Okay, this one, and we will be also providing some file upload. Let's assume that we will be uploading the profile image of the user. Okay, let's go back to our service definition. Okay, we need to refresh this thing. We need to put here, let's say the name will be John. Okay, actually we were using books, not users. Let's put books back here. Okay, let's refresh this thing. Okay, title is Star Wars, whatever. Author is XYZ. Total pages 234. Language English. The other parameters are there. Okay. The additional thing that I need to do is that I also need to specify the profile image parameters. So let's put here like Obi-Wan Kenobi. Okay. So let's hit send. What happens? Okay. So IDs, headers, body, app parameters, files, right? You get two additional input parameters. The first one is the files, which is an object. Under that object, the name of the file, profile file image, and this is basically the file metadata. The contents are not displayed, by the way. Another thing is that the same data is also represented as an array of file objects. Like this is a file list. The same data for this profile image is also provided as a member, as an array object in the file list. Sometimes you might be uploading multiple files and you would like to upload them in just one pass. You don't need to get specific files one by one. In that case, the file list is quite handy. You can use the input. You can use this list as input to upload files node. So as you can see, I mean, there are lots of parameters that you can pass to the start node and through the start node to your service nodes. And we all reviewed about how we can provide these input parameters and how they look like. So in your service designs, in your nodes, in specific expressions, you can reach all of these values and use those values in your expressions. I almost forgot, there is one more additional parameter that you can pass to your start node, and that parameter is the session. session object. So how can you pass the session to your start node? We will go back to our endpoint and we will be marking our endpoint as session required. Okay, so let's update our endpoint. If I go back to the test panel and if I run this endpoint, it will raise an error. Okay, it will say that hey, you need to provide the session token in order for this node to execute, because we marked our endpoint as session required and we need to provide a session token, okay, here as a header parameter to our service, to our endpoint. So how can we create a token? It's quite easy actually. I already defined the service for that one. It's basically like a create new user, like a sign up service, which basically gets a input user object, gets the body, creates the user object in the database, and after the creation of the user object, it creates a user session, okay, using the ID of the new user object created in the database, and returns both the session token and also the user object as a response. So I use this create user session node to create the session token. So let's run this service. Let's run the service. The name will be like John, assuming that the email address will be John at mail.com, and the password will be pwd123456, whatever. So the headers, okay, we've got the API key here. Let's run this thing. Okay, so the user object is created in the database, so we get the response of user. On top of that one, we also get the session object as response. So you see that there's a token here, so I can copy this token, okay, go back to my dummy endpoint service, paste it here, and let's run this thing. So it successfully ran, and as you can see, the session object is also injected into the start node of the endpoint, like the user information, token information, the creation date of the session, some information about the device, operating system, and so on. So I think this is also quite important to learn about how to pass the session information to your endpoint services. That's it for now. Thanks a lot for watching.